I was sitting in a freezing, fluorescent-lit emergency room with a fractured wrist, completely abandoned, because the woman who claimed to love me had just walked out the automatic doors, taking my only lifeline, my phone, right along with her. If you love dramatic, heart-racing stories with unexpected twists and undeniable chemistry, make sure to hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and drop a comment down below to let me know you're ready for this journey. Your support means everything. Now, let's get into the story. Part 1. My ex stole my phone in the ER, then the cold surgeon took me home. The night was supposed to be a celebration. My girlfriend, well, now my ex-girlfriend, Madison, had just landed a minor promotion at her PR firm, and she insisted we attend an exclusive rooftop party in downtown Chicago to celebrate. I had been exhausted after a long week of teaching, my feet already aching before I even strapped on a pair of heels, but I went because I loved her. Or at least I loved the version of her I desperately wanted her to be. The reality of Madison was much harsher, a bitter pill I had been swallowing for 3 years. She was the kind of beautiful that demanded constant attention, and she was ruthless in her pursuit of it. The party, she had essentially abandoned me the second we walked through the door, gravitating toward a group of wealthy executives while I stood awkwardly by the bar, nursing a watered-down club soda. Around midnight, the fatigue caught up with me. I navigated through the sea of intoxicated, overly perfumed bodies to find her, gently touching her shoulder to ask if we could head home. Madison turned around, her eyes flashing with a familiar, toxic annoyance. She jerked her arm away, hissed at me for ruining her networking opportunity, and stormed toward the exit. I hurried after her, my vision blurred by the sudden sting of unshed tears. That's when my heel caught on a thick, exposed speaker cable taped poorly to the floor. I went down hard. My hands instinctively shot out to break my fall, and a sickening, sharp snap echoed in my ears, completely cutting through the heavy bass of the music. Pain, blinding, white-hot, and suffocating, exploded up my left arm. I cried out, clutching my wrist as the world spun dizzily around me. Madison didn't drop to her knees to help me. She didn't scream for help. Instead, she stood over me, let out a heavy, dramatic sigh, and muttered, "Are you kidding me right now, Chloe? You are so unbelievable." She practically dragged me out of the building and shoved me into the passenger seat of her car. The drive to the hospital was agonizing, not just because every bump in the road sent fresh waves of agony radiating from my fractured wrist, but because Madison complained the entire time. She complained about the traffic, about missing the after-party, and about how I always somehow managed to ruin her big nights. I sat there in silence, biting my lips so hard I tasted copper, cradling my swelling arm against my chest. When we finally arrived at the overcrowded emergency room, the misery only deepened. The waiting area was a chaotic symphony of coughing patients, crying infants, and the harsh, sterile smell of bleach. We took our seats in the uncomfortable plastic chairs. After an hour of waiting, Madison was vibrating with irritation. "My phone is dead," she announced abruptly, standing up. "I need to text Sarah to tell her why I missed the toast." "Give me your phone." I blinked up at her, my vision still a little hazy from the pain. "Madison, my battery is at 10%. What if they call my name and you're not here?" "Oh, don't be so dramatic, Chloe. I'm just going to step outside to get a signal, send one text, and come right back." "Hand it over." Too exhausted and in too much pain to fight, I reached into my small clutch with my good hand, pulled out my phone, and handed it to her. Madison snatched it without a word of thanks, turned on her heel, and marched out the sliding glass doors into the chilly night air. I watched her walk away. I waited 10 minutes, then 20, then an hour. By the time the triage nurse finally called out, "Chloe Evans," 2 hours had passed. Madison was gone. She had taken my phone, which also happened to have my ID and debit card tucked neatly into the case. I was entirely alone, injured, with absolutely no way to contact anyone, and not a single dollar to my name. The humiliation that washed over me as I explained my situation to the sympathetic nurse was almost worse than the physical pain. She guided me into a small, curtained examination room, offered me a warm blanket, and promised the doctor would be in shortly. I sat on the edge of the examination table, shivering beneath the thin cotton, tears finally spilling over my cheeks. I wasn't crying because of my broken bone. I was crying because I had spent 3 years of my life loving a woman who could leave me stranded in a hospital just because I was an inconvenience. Tears won't knit the bone back together, Miss Evans. The voice was remarkably smooth, yet icy enough to freeze the air in the tiny room. I jumped, hastily wiping my cheeks with the back of my good hand, and looked up. Stepping through the curtain was quite possibly the most intimidating and striking woman I had ever seen. She was tall, wearing crisp navy scrubs that looked freshly pressed, a stark white lab coat, and a stethoscope draped perfectly around her neck. Her dark hair was pulled back into an immaculate, severe bun, exposing a sharp jawline and piercing, glacial blue eyes that seemed to analyze me right down to my soul. Her badge read, Dr. Harper Vance. Orthopedic surgery. I'm sorry, I stammered, my voice thick with emotion. I know. I'm fine. Dr. Vance stepped closer, her expression completely unreadable. There was no warmth in her gaze, no pity, and absolutely no bedside manner. She moved with a calculated, robotic efficiency. Let's see the wrist, she commanded, her tone leaving no room for argument. I hesitantly held out my left arm. Her fingers wrapped around my forearm, and I sharply inhaled. Not from pain, but from the sudden electric jolt of her touch. Despite her cold, detached demeanor, her hands were surprisingly warm, her touch incredibly gentle and precise. It was a jarring contrast. She examined the swelling, her eyes fixed entirely on my injury, completely ignoring my blotchy, tear-stained face. Distal radius fracture, Dr. Vance stated flatly, her thumb tracing the line of my bone, sending a strange shiver up my spine. It's a clean break, but it requires immediate setting before we cast it. I'm going to administer a local anesthetic block. It will burn, and then your arm will go numb. Do you understand? Yes, I whispered, unable to look away from her face. She was so close I could smell the faint scent of her perfume, something sharp, clean, and expensive like cedar and winter air. Throughout the entire procedure, Dr. Vance barely spoke, except to issue brief commands. When she set the bone, she did it with remarkable strength and swiftness. I gasped, instinctively squeezing my eyes shut and biting back a cry. To my shock, I felt a firm, steady hand rest on my uninjured shoulder. Breathe, she instructed, her voice dropping a fraction of an octave, losing just a hint of its icy edge. It's over. Within 30 minutes, my arm was encased in a lightweight fiberglass cast, resting snugly in a sling. Dr. Vance stripped off her gloves, tossing them into the biohazard bin with perfect aim. Keep it elevated. Take the prescribed anti-inflammatories. I'll need to see you in my clinic in 2 weeks for a follow-up X-ray, she said, already turning toward the door, her attention having clearly moved on to the next crisis waiting in the ER. The nurse will bring your discharge papers. Wait, I called out, panic suddenly rising in my throat. I don't have a way to get the prescription. Or a way to get home. My ex took my phone and my wallet. I'm completely stranded. Dr. Vance paused, her hand on the edge of the curtain. She looked back at me, her piercing blue eyes sweeping over my disheveled party dress, my bare, shivering legs, and the heavy cast holding my arm. For a split second, I thought I saw a flicker of something cross her stoic features. Annoyance? Pity? Disdain? The hospital has a courtesy phone at the front desk, she said coldly. You can call a cab. Have them bill you at your residence. With that, she swept out of the room, leaving me feeling even colder than before. I was discharged at 3:15 a.m. The waiting room had emptied out, leaving only a few sleeping figures scattered across the chairs. I walked up to the reception desk, the harsh reality of my situation crashing down on me. I didn't have a landline at my apartment. I couldn't remember a single phone number by heart. Who does these days? And even if I could get a cab to take me home and promise to pay them later, my apartment keys were in my missing clutch. Madison had locked the door when we left. I was locked out, broken, and alone. With defeat heavy in my chest, I retreated to a dark corner of the waiting room. I curled my knees up to my chest, wrapped my good arm around my shivering body, and simply surrendered. I closed my eyes, letting the exhaustion drag me into a fitful, miserable doze. What are you still doing here? My eyes snapped open. The digital clock on the wall read 5 a.m. Standing over me was Dr. Harper Vance. She was no longer in her lab coat or scrubs. She wore a sleek, tailored black turtleneck, tailored gray trousers, and a long, expensive-looking dark wool coat. A sleek leather bag was slung over her shoulder. She looked tired, the shadows under her blue eyes a little more prominent, but she still radiated that same intimidating, unapproachable aura. I swallowed hard, trying to sit up straight and preserve whatever tiny shred of dignity I had left. I told you. I have no phone, no money, and I just realized my keys were in the bag my ex took. So, I'm locked out. I figured I'd just sit here until the sun comes up and then figure it out. Dr. Vance stared at me. The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. Her eyes narrowed slightly, analyzing me the same way she had analyzed my fractured bone, looking for the break, assessing the damage. I expected her to lecture me on hospital loitering policies or offer another unhelpful, sterile suggestion. Instead, she let out a long, heavy sigh that seemed to carry the weight of her entire grueling shift. The temperature is dropping below freezing outside, and you are wearing a silk dress, she said, her voice devoid of any warmth, yet the words themselves sent a sudden flutter through my stomach. She checked her silver wristwatch, her jaw tightening. Dr. Vance looked back down at me, her expression unyielding. My car is parked out front. Get up, Miss Evans. You're coming home with me. End of part 1. Part 2, The Cold Sanctuary. I stared at Dr. Harper Vance, my brain struggling to process the words that had just left her perfectly sculpted lips. You're coming home with me. It was a command, not a question, delivered with the same sterile authority she had used to instruct the nurses in the emergency room. I sat frozen in the hard plastic chair, my good hand gripping the edge of the seat as if it were the only thing anchoring me to reality. What? I whispered, my voice raspy from exhaustion and the remnants of unshed tears. Dr. Vance, I couldn't possibly. I'll just wait here until I can reach a locksmith or maybe use the courtesy phone to track down Madison. Miss Evans, Harper interrupted, her tone sharp enough to cut glass. She didn't raise her voice, but the sheer command in it forced my mouth shut instantly. It is 5 a.m. You are wearing a thin, sleeveless dress in 30-degree weather. You have a freshly fractured radius, elevated stress levels, and you are displaying early signs of a minor shock response. I do not have the patience to argue with a stubborn patient after a 14-hour shift. Get up. She didn't wait for me to agree. She simply turned on her heel and began walking toward the sliding glass exit doors, the long hem of her dark wool coat sweeping elegantly behind her. Panic, exhaustion, and a strange, unexplainable magnetic pull warred inside my chest. I had absolutely no options left. With a heavy sigh, I carefully stood up, cradling my heavy fiberglass cast against my chest, and hurried to follow her. The moment the automatic doors parted, the brutal Chicago wind slapped me across the face. Cold was instantaneous and agonizing, biting into my bare legs and arms. I let out an involuntary gasp, my teeth immediately beginning to chatter. Before I could wrap my good arm around my shivering torso, a heavy weight dropped over my shoulders. I flinched, looking up to see that Harper had effortlessly shrugged off her expensive wool coat and draped it over me. The fabric was incredibly warm, smelling faintly of that same intoxicating cedar and winter air perfume. I started, looking at her in shock. She was now standing in just her tailored black turtleneck, the freezing wind whipping her dark hair around her face, yet she looked completely unbothered by the cold. You're going to freeze. My car is right here. Get in, she ordered, gesturing to a sleek, pitch-black SUV idling at the curb. I didn't argue again. I awkwardly maneuvered myself into the passenger seat, struggling slightly with the heavy door because of my cast. Harper was in the driver's seat a second later, the doors locking with a soft, expensive-sounding click. The interior of the car was immaculate, supple black leather, subtle ambient lighting, and an overwhelmingly calming silence that completely shut out the chaotic noise of the hospital. Without a word, Harper reached over to the center console and pressed a button. A moment later, a deep, soothing heat began to radiate through my seat, seeping into my frozen muscles. I slumped back against the headrest, letting out a shaky breath, pulling her coat tighter around my shoulders. The drive was agonizingly silent. The streets of the city were mostly empty, bathed in the eerie orange glow of streetlights. I kept stealing glances at Harper from the corner of my eye. Her profile was striking in the dim light, her jaw clenched, her blue eyes fixed intently on the road. She drove exactly how she practiced medicine, with flawless, calculated precision. I couldn't help but compare the silence in this car to the agonizing car ride with Madison just a few hours prior. Madison had filled the air with venom, complaints, and blame, making my pain entirely about her inconvenience. Harper was completely silent, cold, and distant, yet she had wrapped me in her coat and turned on the heated seat. It was a dizzying contradiction. "Do you want me to turn on the radio?" Harper's voice suddenly sliced through the quiet, startling me. "No," I answered softly. "The quiet is nice." "Thank you." She didn't reply, simply keeping her eyes on the road. 20 minutes later, we pulled into the underground parking garage of a towering, ultra-modern luxury high-rise in the Gold Coast neighborhood. My stomach twisted with fresh anxiety. I was a high school English teacher who lived in a cramped, drafty apartment with mismatched furniture and a roommate who played the bass guitar at odd hours. This building screamed a level of wealth and status that I had only ever seen in movies. Harper guided me into a private elevator, swiping a sleek black keycard over the panel. The doors slid shut, and we shot upward, my ears popping as we bypassed dozens of floors. When the doors finally opened, they didn't reveal a hallway, but rather opened directly into a sprawling, breathtaking penthouse. I stepped out, my jaw dropping slightly. The apartment was massive, featuring floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a stunning panoramic view of the Chicago skyline, the dark waters of Lake Michigan stretching out into the horizon. The interior was fiercely minimalist. White marble floors, charcoal gray furniture, glass tables, and abstract, monochromatic art on the walls. It was impeccably clean and perfectly organized. It also looked completely devoid of human life. There were no photographs, no thrown blankets, no stray coffee mugs. It was as beautiful and as cold as the woman who lived there. "Take your shoes off," Harper instructed, slipping out of her own sleek leather loafers and placing them neatly on a rack. I awkwardly kicked off my heels, my toes curling against the freezing marble floor. Harper noticed, her brow furrowing slightly before she walked past me toward a long hallway. "Follow me." I trailed behind her, feeling entirely out of place in my ruined, wrinkled silk party dress and her oversized coat. She led me to a spacious guest bedroom. It had a massive, perfectly made bed with crisp white linens and a large ensuite bathroom. Harper walked over to a dark oak dresser, pulled open a drawer, and retrieved a folded stack of clothes. She turned and held them out to me. "Sweatpants. They have a drawstring so they should fit. And a short-sleeved shirt so it won't compress your cast. The bathroom has fresh towels, a new toothbrush, and whatever else you might need." "Thank you, Dr. Vance." "Really? I don't know how I can ever repay you for this," I said, taking the clothes with my right hand. "You can repay me by going to sleep and not requiring any further medical attention tonight," she replied dryly, not a hint of a smile on her face. "My bedroom is at the end of the hall if there is an absolute emergency. Otherwise, I will see you in the morning." She turned to leave, her hand resting on the brass doorknob. "Wait!" I blurted out, the panic seizing my chest before I could stop the word from escaping. Harper paused, looking back over her shoulder, her icy blue eyes narrowing. "Are you in pain? I prescribed you." "No, it's not the pain," I interrupted, my cheeks suddenly flushing with deep, burning heat. I looked down at the floor, suddenly feeling incredibly small and vulnerable. "It's my dress." Harper looked at me, waiting for an explanation. "The zipper," I mumbled, gesturing weakly to my back with my good hand. "It's a hidden zipper. Goes all the way up to my neck. I can't reach it with only one hand. I can't get it off." The silence that followed felt thicker than concrete. I squeezed my eyes shut, mortified. First, I had let my ex abandon me, then I had loitered in her hospital, then I had accepted her charity, and now I was asking this terrifying, gorgeous surgeon to undress me. I heard the soft thud of her leather bag hitting the floor. Then, the quiet, deliberate sound of her footsteps crossing the room toward me. "Turn around," she commanded softly. I swallowed hard and slowly turned my back to her. The heavy wool coat slid off my shoulders, pooling onto the floor, leaving my bare back exposed to the cool air of the bedroom. I held the clean clothes tightly to my chest, my heart hammering so violently against my ribs I was terrified she could hear it. I felt her step closer. The heat radiating from her body was a stark contrast to the chill in the room. Then I felt her hands. Harper didn't wear gloves this time. Her bare fingers brushed gently against the skin at the nape of my neck as she searched for the tiny, hidden clasp of the zipper. Her touch was electric, sending a sharp, involuntary shiver cascading down my spine. Contact was purely functional, purely necessary, yet it felt impossibly intimate. "Hold still," she murmured, her breath ghosting warmly across the back of my neck. I held my breath. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. I could only focus on the sensation of her knuckles lightly grazing my bare spine as she slowly, carefully pulled the zipper down. The mechanism caught halfway, the fabric snagging slightly. Harper let out a soft noise of frustration, stepping even closer. Her front brushed lightly against my back, just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough to make my knees go weak. "Got it," she whispered. The zipper slid smoothly down to the small of my back. Tension in the dress vanished, the silk loosening around my shoulders. She immediately stepped back, putting distance between us. The sudden loss of her warmth left me feeling strangely hollow. "Thank you," I breathed, keeping my back turned, clutching the front of the dress so it wouldn't fall. "Go to sleep, Miss Evans," Harper said, her voice completely devoid of the strange, heavy tension that had just filled the room. I heard her walk to the door, pause for a second, and then step out into the hallway. The door clicked shut, leaving me completely alone in the silent, beautiful room. I stood there for a long time, the throbbing pain in my wrist completely overshadowed by the burning sensation lingering on my spine where her fingers had touched me. Madison had broken my heart tonight, but as I slipped into Harper Vance's bed, surrounded by the faint scent of cedar and winter air, I realized something far more terrifying. I was in way over my head. End of part 2. Part 3, the morning after. I woke up to the sensation of a dull, rhythmic throbbing radiating from my left arm. For a few blissful, disoriented seconds, I was completely unaware of my surroundings. I was tangled in sheets that felt like spun silk, my cheek pressed against a pillow that was undeniably the softest thing I had ever slept on. Then, the events of the previous night came crashing down on me like an avalanche. The party. The exposed cable. The sickening snap of my wrist. Madison's cruel, annoyed sigh as I lay on the floor. The agonizing wait in the emergency room. Her stealing my phone, my ID, my only way home. And then, Dr. Harper Vance. I opened my eyes, staring up at the unfamiliar, immaculate white ceiling of the guest bedroom. The heavy fiberglass cast encasing my arm felt like an anchor, but the oversized gray sweatpants and soft cotton t-shirt I wore, Harper's clothes, felt like a bizarrely comforting armor. I lay there for a long time, listening to the absolute silence of the penthouse. It was a stark contrast to my own apartment, where the sounds of traffic and my roommate's questionable music choices were a constant soundtrack. Carefully, I sat up, swinging my legs over the edge of the bed. My bare feet met the plush rug, and I took a deep breath, trying to push down the rising tide of panic. I was a 30-year-old high school English teacher who had just spent the night in the multi-million-dollar penthouse of the cold, terrifyingly beautiful surgeon who had set my broken bone. I had no money, no keys, and no phone. I was entirely at her mercy. I made my way to the en-suite bathroom, splashing cold water on my face with my good hand. The dark circles under my eyes were prominent, my brown hair a chaotic, tangled mess. I looked exactly like a woman who had been dumped, injured, and stranded all in one night. Gathering whatever shredded remnants of my dignity I could find, I stepped out of the bedroom and into the hallway. Penthouse was flooded with brilliant, harsh morning sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The view of Lake Michigan was breathtaking, the water glittering like crushed diamonds, but my attention was instantly captured by the figure standing in the open-concept kitchen. Harper was awake. Of course she was. She was no longer wearing the sleek, dark clothes from the night before. Instead, she was dressed in a pair of perfectly tailored cream-colored trousers and a fitted charcoal gray cashmere sweater. Her dark hair was loose today, cascading in soft, elegant waves over her shoulders, softening the severe lines of her jawline. She was standing in front of a massive, stainless steel espresso machine, tapping away at a sleek silver tablet on the marble counter. She looked up the moment my bare feet patted against the hardwood floor. Those glacial blue eyes locked onto mine, instantly analyzing me from head to toe. "You're awake," she stated. It wasn't a greeting, it was a factual observation. "Pain levels?" "Manageable," I lied instinctively, swallowing hard as I approached the kitchen island. "A dull ache mostly." "Thank you." Harper's eyes narrowed slightly, zeroing in on the tight line of my jaw. "Do not lie to me, Miss Evans. You are 24 hours out from a displaced distal radius fracture. Feels like someone is driving a hot spike into your joint. Sit down." I obeyed immediately, climbing onto one of the tall, modern leather bar stools. She was right, of course. My wrist was screaming. Harper turned around, pulling a small, amber prescription bottle from the counter. She shook out a single white pill, poured a glass of water from a sleek glass pitcher, and slid both across the marble island toward me. "Take it," she commanded softly. There is no nobility in suffering through acute pain. I picked up the pill with my right hand and swallowed it down. As I set the glass back on the counter, Harper turned back to the espresso machine. A moment later, she set a steaming ceramic mug in front of me. The aroma was rich, complex, and heavenly. "I didn't know how you take it," she said, not meeting my eyes as she picked up her own black coffee. "There is milk and sugar in the refrigerator, should you require it." "Black is fine," I murmured, wrapping my good hand around the warm mug. "Dr. Vance, I need to figure out my next steps. I feel terrible for imposing on you like this. If I can just use your phone to call a locksmith, I can get back into my apartment. I can contact my bank from my laptop once I'm inside and wire you the money for the cab fare and—" "Stop," Harper interrupted, raising a single elegant hand. She took a slow sip of her coffee, her expression completely unreadable. "You are not taking a cab anywhere. You are heavily medicated, sleep-deprived, and vulnerable." "I'm fine," I protested weakly, though the tremor in my voice betrayed me. "I can't just stay here. I have to get my life back in order. I have to find Madison and get my things." At the mention of Madison's name, the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Harper set her coffee mug down with a sharp, deliberate clink. She leaned forward, resting her forearms on the marble counter, bringing her face intimidatingly close to mine. I could smell her perfume again, that intoxicating blend of cedar and cold air, mixed now with the rich scent of espresso. "Let me be perfectly clear, Chloe," she said, using my first name for the very first time. The sound of it rolling off her tongue sent a sudden, traitorous spark straight to my chest. "The woman who left you abandoned in an emergency room with a fractured bone and no resources does not deserve your frantic attempts to locate her. She is a liability. And I do not tolerate liabilities in my presence." I stared at her, completely stunned by the venom in her voice. Why did she care? To her, I was just a pathetic patient she had taken pity on. Yet, the fierce protectiveness in her tone was undeniable. "She has my phone," I whispered, looking down at my lap, suddenly feeling very small. "My ID, my debit card, everything. My whole life is in that case. I don't have a choice." Harper stared at me for a long, agonizing moment. Then, she let out a quiet sigh, the harsh lines around her mouth softening just a fraction. She reached across the counter and slid her silver tablet toward me. "Log into your cloud account," she instructed, her tone returning to its usual brisk efficiency. "Locate the device using the tracking feature. If it is turned on, we will find it. If she has turned it off, you will log into your social media and message a mutual contact to demand its return." I nodded, my throat tight with a mixture of gratitude and anxiety. I clumsily tapped the screen with my right index finger, navigating to the tracking website and typing in my credentials. My heart hammered against my ribs as the loading circle spun on the screen. A map of Chicago appeared. A tiny green dot was blinking steadily in the near north side. "It's on," I breathed, relief washing over me. "It's at her apartment. She must be asleep." Harper leaned over my shoulder to look at the screen. She was so close I could feel the warmth radiating from her body, completely distracting me from the glowing map. "Good," she murmured, her breath ghosting over the shell of my ear. "Now, check your messages. See if she has had the basic human decency to attempt an apology." I hesitated but clicked open my synced messaging app. The screen populated with notifications. My stomach instantly plummeted into my shoes. There were no apologies. There were only 3 texts from Madison sent around 3 a.m. "Madison, you are so selfish, Chloe." "Madison, I had to leave the ER because Sarah was having a meltdown about the firm and you were just sitting there pouting. You always have to make my nights about you." "Madison, I took your phone by accident. Don't be dramatic. Come get it tomorrow, I'm sleeping in." Tears stung the corners of my eyes before I could stop them. I blinked rapidly, turning my head away so Harper wouldn't see. After 3 years of trying to be perfect for her, after supporting her through every crisis, this was what I got. Blame. Cold, callous blame while I sat alone with a broken bone. A sudden, warm weight settled on my right shoulder. I jumped slightly, looking up. Harper's hand was resting gently on my shoulder, her long fingers giving a firm, grounding squeeze. I looked into her glacial blue eyes and found, to my absolute shock, that the ice had cracked. There was a dangerous, dark fury swirling in her gaze, directed entirely at the messages on the screen. "Dr. Vance," I started, my voice cracking humiliatingly. "Harper," she corrected softly, her thumb brushing a slow, mesmerizing pattern against my collarbone. "Call me Harper." She pulled her hand back, though the ghost of her touch lingered, burning through the fabric of the oversized t-shirt. She stood up straight, smoothing down the front of her cashmere sweater with a clinical, decisive motion. The momentary softness was gone, replaced by a steely, terrifying resolve. "Finish your coffee, Chloe," Harper commanded, walking past the kitchen island toward the front hallway. "Go to the bathroom, brush your hair, and put your shoes on." "What?" I asked, bewildered, twisting in my chair to look at her. "Why? Where are we going?" Harper paused at the doorway, slipping a sleek pair of dark sunglasses out of her purse and sliding them onto her face. Even indoors, she looked incredibly intimidating, like a predatory bird ready to strike. "We are going to the near north side," Harper stated, her voice dangerously calm. "We are going to wake up your ex-girlfriend. We are retrieving your belongings. And then I am going to have a very brief, very clear conversation with her about the consequences of medical neglect." Before I could even process the absolute thrill and terror of that statement, she turned on her heel and disappeared down the hall. End of Part 3. Part 4, Surgical Precision. The silence in the penthouse was instantly shattered by the sheer weight of Harper's declaration. She didn't wait for my response, her sleek, dark sunglasses shielding her eyes as she turned and strode down the expansive hallway, the soft click of her expensive loafers echoing against the marble floor. I sat frozen on the leather barstool for 3 long seconds, my brain desperately trying to catch up with the sudden, violent shift in reality. She was coming with me. Dr. Harper Vance, the brilliant, intimidating, unapproachable orthopedic surgeon who had painstakingly set my shattered bone just hours ago, was essentially offering to act as my personal bodyguard against my toxic ex-girlfriend. My heart hammered a frantic, terrified rhythm against my ribs. I scrambled down from the stool, my bare feet padding rapidly across the cold floor. I hurried into the lavish guest bathroom, ignoring the chaotic reflection of my tangled brown hair and pale face in the mirror. With my right hand, I awkwardly ran the brand-new toothbrush Harper had provided under the faucet, scrubbing my teeth with frantic urgency. I didn't bother trying to tame my hair. There was no point. I felt completely raw, entirely out of my depth, and entirely too dependent on the formidable woman waiting for me by the front door. When I emerged into the foyer, Harper was standing by the private elevator, her posture impossibly straight. She had draped her heavy, expensive dark wool coat over her arm. As I approached, looking disheveled in her oversized gray sweatpants and cotton t-shirt, she didn't say a word. She simply stepped forward and draped the coat over my shoulders, just as she had done outside the emergency room. "The wind has picked up," she stated quietly, her voice smooth and devoid of the sharp edge it had carried in the kitchen. She carefully adjusted the collar around my neck, her knuckles lightly brushing against my jawline. The brief contact sent a jolt of electricity straight to my toes, temporarily short-circuiting the throbbing ache in my cast. "Keep the arms stabilized against your chest. Let me do the talking." "Harper, you really don't have to do this," I whispered, pulling the heavy wool tight around my shivering frame. "I can just ask for the bag and leave. The Madison is, she can be very cruel when she's backed into a corner. I don't want you to be subjected to her." Harper pressed the call button for the elevator. She slowly turned her head to look at me, her dark sunglasses reflecting my anxious face. Corner of her mouth twitched upward in a micro-expression that was equal parts terrifying and fiercely protective. "Chloe," she said, her tone dropping into a low, dangerous register that made my breath catch. "I spend 10 hours a day meticulously cutting into human bone, drilling titanium plates into shattered limbs, and navigating the chaotic, blood-soaked trenches of a Level 1 trauma center. Your ex-girlfriend is an insecure PR representative with a superiority complex. I assure you she does not frighten me." The elevator doors slid open with a soft ping. I swallowed hard, entirely stripped of any further arguments, and followed her inside. The drive to the near north side was thick with an anticipatory tension. The city was fully awake now, the gray morning sky hanging low over the bustling Chicago streets. Pedestrians hurried along the sidewalks, bundled in heavy scarves and jackets, completely oblivious to the impending confrontation brewing inside the pitch-black SUV. I sat in the heated passenger seat, my good hand gripping the edge of the leather armrest so tightly my knuckles turned white. I had spent 3 years of my life shrinking myself to fit into Madison's world. I had learned to apologize for her bad moods, to take the blame for her mistakes, and to quietly absorb the casual cruelty she disguised as honesty. The thought of standing in front of her, defying her, and demanding basic respect felt like stepping off a cliff without a parachute. "Breathe, Chloe," Harper commanded softly, not taking her eyes off the traffic. I gasped, realizing I had been holding my breath. "I'm sorry. I hate conflict. She has this way of twisting everything until you feel like you're the one who ruined everything. She'll say I'm being dramatic about my arm. She'll say I embarrassed her by leaving the hospital." "She can say whatever she likes," Harper replied calmly, her grip on the steering wheel relaxed and confident. "Words do not alter facts. The fact is, she committed an act of gross negligence. The fact is, she stole your property. And the fact is, she is going to return it to you today, or I will involve the Chicago Police Department and have her charged with grand theft and reckless endangerment." I turned my head to stare at her, my mouth slightly open. She wasn't exaggerating. She was entirely serious. We pulled up to Madison's upscale apartment building 15 minutes later. It was a modern, glass-fronted high-rise, though noticeably less exclusive than Harper's Gold Coast penthouse. Harper parallel parked the heavy SUV with effortless precision, killed the engine, and stepped out into the freezing wind. I scrambled out after her, cradling my heavy fiberglass cast beneath the folds of the wool coat. We walked into the lobby. I recognized the doorman, a sweet older man named Henry, who gave me a sympathetic look as he noticed my sling. I murmured a quiet greeting, bypassing the front desk and leading Harper straight to the elevators. The ride up to the 14th floor felt like a death march. When the doors opened, I led Harper down the plushly carpeted hallway. My heart was beating so violently in my throat I felt nauseous. We stopped in front of door 14B. I hesitated, my hand trembling as I reached out to knock. Before my knuckles could graze the wood, Harper effortlessly stepped in front of me. She didn't knock. She raised her fist and pounded on the heavy wooden door with 3 sharp, deafening, authoritative strikes that echoed loudly down the entire corridor. We waited. Silence. Harper pounded again, harder this time. "I'm coming, Jesus Christ, hold on," a familiar, irritable voice shrieked from the other side of the door. The deadbolt clicked. The door swung inward, and there stood Madison. She looked exactly as I expected. Hungover, annoyed, and wearing a pair of expensive silk pajama bottoms paired with an oversized faded band t-shirt that belonged to me. Her blonde hair was a messy knot on top of her head, and remnants of last night's heavy mascara were smudged under her eyes. She opened her mouth to snap at whoever was bothering her, but the words died in her throat the moment she saw me. Her eyes dropped to my heavy cast, then snapped up to my face, her expression immediately hardening into a defensive glare. "Chloe." "Seriously?" Madison sighed, leaning heavily against the doorframe, crossing her arms over her chest. She completely ignored Harper, who was standing slightly to my right, still wearing her dark sunglasses. "I told you I was sleeping in. You couldn't have waited until noon? You always have to make everything an absolute crisis, don't you?" "It's just a sprained wrist." The familiar wave of guilt and inadequacy tried to wash over me, conditioned by years of emotional manipulation. I opened my mouth to speak, to apologize for waking her up, to meekly ask for my things. But Harper didn't give me the chance. "It is a displaced distal radius fracture, actually," Harper's voice sliced through the hallway, cold, sharp, and terrifyingly calm. Madison flinched, finally turning her attention to the tall, imposing woman standing beside me. She blinked, taking in Harper's immaculate cashmere sweater, her tailored trousers, and the absolute aura of dominance radiating from her. "And who the hell are you?" Madison sneered, though I could hear the faint tremor of insecurity beneath her bravado. Her new lawyer? Or did she just find a new victim to complain to? Harper slowly reached up and pulled her sunglasses off, revealing eyes so piercingly blue and utterly devoid of warmth that Madison actually took a physical half-step backward into her apartment. "I am Dr. Harper Vance," she stated, her voice dangerously quiet. She took one step forward, effortlessly invading Madison's space, forcing my ex to press her back against the doorframe. "I am the lead orthopedic surgeon at Chicago Memorial. I am the physician who spent 45 minutes resetting Chloe's shattered bone while she was in a state of clinical shock, a condition directly caused by your abandonment." Madison's jaw dropped slightly. A flush of embarrassing, angry red crept up her neck. Look, she was fine. She just tripped. She's always clumsy. "Quiet," Harper commanded. It wasn't a shout, it was an absolute, undeniable order. Madison's mouth snapped shut with an audible click. Harper looked her up and down, her eyes filled with a clinical, dissecting disgust. It was the same look she might give a festering, unsalvageable wound. "You left an injured, vulnerable woman in a trauma center. You stole her only method of communication, her identification, and her financial resources, leaving her entirely stranded in freezing temperatures, Harper continued, her voice echoing off the hallway walls, trapping Madison in her absolute authority. Your behavior is not merely selfish. It is a pathetic, narcissistic display of emotional depravity. You are a localized infection, Madison. And right now, I am excising you from my patient's life. Madison was completely speechless. Her bravado had evaporated, leaving behind a terrified, humiliated shell. She looked at me, her eyes wide with shock, searching for me to rescue her, to defend her like I always did. I stood there, wrapped in Harper's warm coat, and felt absolutely nothing for the woman in the doorway. The spell was broken. Where is her bag? Harper demanded, her voice like a cracking whip. It's on the kitchen counter, Madison stammered, pointing a shaking finger into the apartment. Retrieve it. Now. Madison practically tripped over her own feet as she spun around and sprinted into her apartment. A few seconds later, she reappeared, thrusting my small black clutch toward me. I reached out with my right hand and took it, clutching it tightly against my chest. If you ever contact her again, Harper said, leaning in just an inch closer to Madison's pale face, if you text her, if you call her, or if you ever approach her in public, I will ensure that the legal and financial consequences you face will ruin whatever pathetic public relations career you are desperately clinging to. Do we understand each other? Madison nodded frantically, her eyes wide with genuine fear. Yes. I won't. I'm sorry. Do not apologize to me, Harper sneered softly. You are entirely beneath my notice. Harper turned her back on Madison with a dramatic, fluid grace. She looked at me, the icy fury in her eyes instantly melting into something softer, something incredibly protective. Do you have everything you need, Chloe? She asked gently. I looked down at the clutch in my hand, feeling the solid weight of my phone and my keys inside. A massive, suffocating weight lifted off my chest, a weight I hadn't even realized I was carrying for the past 3 years. I looked back up at Harper, my heart swelling with a chaotic mixture of gratitude, awe, and a terrifying, undeniable attraction. Yes, I breathed, a genuine smile finally breaking across my exhausted face. I have everything. Good, Harper said, her hand reaching out to firmly, gently guide me by the small of my back. Let's go home. End of Part 4. Part 5, The Aftershock. The heavy wooden door of apartment 14B clicked shut, severing the very last tether I had to the past 3 years of my life. I stood in the plush, overly perfumed hallway of Madison's building, the small black clutch gripped tightly in my right hand. The silence that followed the confrontation was deafening. My heart was hammering a frantic, violent rhythm against my ribs, and suddenly the adrenaline that had been keeping me upright began to rapidly drain from my system. My knees grew weak, and a severe tremor seized my good hand. I had done it. Or rather, Harper had done it for me, acting as the impenetrable shield I had never possessed. Harper stood beside me, her posture impeccably straight, completely unbothered by the sheer magnitude of the emotional execution she had just performed. She slid her dark sunglasses back onto her face, masking those piercing, glacial blue eyes, and calmly pressed the button for the elevator. Breathe, Chloe, Harper instructed, her voice low and even. She didn't look at me, but her awareness of my physical state was uncanny. Inhale for 4 seconds. Hold for 4. Exhale for 6. You are experiencing an acute adrenaline crash. It is entirely physiological. I squeezed my eyes shut and followed her instructions, drawing in a shaky breath of the hallway's stale, air-conditioned air. By the time the elevator arrived with a soft chime, my heartbeat had slowed from a frantic sprint to a manageable jog. We stepped inside the mirrored cab. As the doors slid shut, effectively sealing us in our own private, quiet world, the absolute absurdity of the situation finally hit me. I looked at the reflection of the woman standing next to me. Dr. Harper Vance, a highly respected, immensely wealthy trauma surgeon, had just bullied my toxic ex-girlfriend into submission on a Thursday morning. A choked, slightly hysterical laugh escaped my lips before I could stop it. Harper turned her head, her dark brows furrowing slightly over the rim of her sunglasses. "Are you experiencing pain?" "No," I managed to say, leaning my head back against the cool glass of the elevator wall. I looked at her, a genuine, exhausted smile pulling at the corners of my mouth. "I'm experiencing disbelief. I can't believe you just did that. You completely destroyed her." She looked like she was going to faint. A tiny, almost imperceptible smirk ghosted across Harper's lips. It was a fleeting expression, gone before I could fully analyze it, but it sent a sudden, fierce spark of electricity straight down my spine. "As I said, she is a bully who relies on the passivity of others to maintain her delusions of grandeur," Harper replied dryly, stepping out as the doors opened on the ground floor. "Once you remove the passivity, bullies have no remaining leverage. It is simple behavioral mechanics." We walked out of the building and back into the freezing, chaotic Chicago wind. I clutched Harper's heavy wool coat tighter around my shoulders, grateful for the lingering scent of cedar and winter air that clung to the fabric. Grounded me. When we were sealed back inside the heated sanctuary of her sleek black SUV, I reached into the clutch and pulled out my apartment keys. The jagged edges of the metal felt heavy in my palm. It was the key to my freedom, but looking at it filled me with a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread. "I have my keys," I said quietly, the words feeling like ash in my mouth. I guess you can take me to my apartment now. It's in Logan Square. I can give you the address." Harper didn't start the engine. She sat perfectly still, her leather-gloved hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. She slowly turned her head to look at me, pulling off her sunglasses and tossing them onto the center console. The air in the car suddenly grew incredibly thick, charged with that same intense, undeniable gravity she carried everywhere she went. "You are 24 hours post-trauma with a displaced fracture," Harper stated, her tone shifting seamlessly back into clinical authority. "You are running on a severe sleep deficit, emotional shock, and prescription narcotics. You informed me last night that your roommate is a musician with a chaotic schedule." "She is," I admitted, my voice small. "But I've already imposed on you so much, Harper. You literally rescued me. You got my things back. I can't ask you to be my nursemaid." "You did not ask," Harper countered smoothly. Her glacial blue eyes locked onto mine, completely unyielding. "I am making a medical determination. You cannot open a child-proof pill bottle with one hand. You cannot safely prepare a meal. If you return to a disruptive environment, your elevated cortisol levels will impede the osteoblastic activity required for your bone to properly fuse. You are staying at my apartment through the weekend." I stared at her, my mouth slightly open. It was the most elaborate, medically complex excuse I had ever heard. She was using her authority as a surgeon to mask a directive that felt surprisingly, terrifyingly personal. She didn't want me to leave. "Okay," I whispered, the fight entirely draining out of me, replaced by a warm, fluttering sensation in my stomach. "Okay." Through the weekend. Harper gave a single, curt nod. She pushed the ignition button, the powerful engine purring to life, and expertly merged back into the morning traffic. When we arrived back at the Gold Coast penthouse, the sun was fully up, flooding the minimalist, immaculate space with brilliant natural light. The sprawling view of Lake Michigan was breathtaking, but I felt entirely disgusting. Between the sweat from the adrenaline crash, the lingering hospital smell, and the fact that I had been wearing the same oversized t-shirt since the night before, my skin was crawling. "Harper?" I asked hesitantly, standing awkwardly by the kitchen island as she began unpacking a sleek grocery delivery box that had been waiting at her door. "Is there any way I could take a shower? I know I can't get the cast wet, but I feel like a biohazard." Harper paused, holding a carton of organic eggs. She looked at me, her eyes sweeping over my disheveled hair and pale face. "The fiberglass cannot be exposed to moisture, and the steam alone can compromise the synthetic padding beneath it," she said analytically. She set the eggs down and wiped her hands on a linen towel. However, basic hygiene is necessary for infection control and psychological morale. Come with me. I followed her down the long hallway, bypassing the guest room and stopping in front of double frosted glass doors at the very end of the corridor. Harper pushed them open, revealing the master bathroom. It was larger than my entire living room in Logan Square. It was entirely done in dark slate gray stone, featuring a massive walk-in rain shower encased in glass, and a deep freestanding white soaking tub situated next to a floor-to-ceiling window. Harper walked over to a sleek vanity and pulled out a heavy velvet stool, placing it next to the tub. She then opened a cabinet and produced a roll of heavy-duty medical cling wrap and waterproof surgical tape. "Sit," she commanded softly. I awkwardly perched on the edge of the velvet stool. Harper knelt in front of me. She took my left arm, supporting the heavy cast with an incredibly gentle touch that completely betrayed her cold demeanor. Carefully, meticulously, she began to wrap the plastic around the fiberglass, securing it tightly with the surgical tape. She was so close I could feel the radiant heat of her body, and I instinctively held my breath. "You will wash your body with a sponge at the sink," Harper instructed, her eyes entirely focused on her task. "But you cannot wash your own hair with one hand. I will assist you." My heart did a violent flip. "Harper, you don't have to." "Chloe," she interrupted, her voice dropping a fraction of an octave, soft and dangerously intimate. "I am a physician. I am entirely accustomed to assisting patients. Do not make this more complicated than it needs to be." She finished securing the plastic and stood up. She walked over to the deep soaking tub and turned on the sleek silver faucet. A detachable showerhead on a long, flexible metal hose rested on the edge. "Take off the shirt," she said calmly, adjusting the water temperature with her back to me. "Keep the sweatpants on if it makes you more comfortable. Lean back over the edge of the tub. I will use the handheld nozzle." My face burned with a sudden intense heat. I hesitated for only a second before reaching up with my right hand, awkwardly gripping the collar of the oversized t-shirt and pulling it over my head. I was left wearing only a simple black lace bra. I shivered, though the room was incredibly warm. I turned around, sitting on the stool, and carefully leaned backward so the back of my neck rested against the smooth, cool porcelain edge of the massive tub. Harper stepped behind me. I looked up at her from an upside-down perspective. Her face was completely devoid of its usual severe tension. She looked relaxed, focused, and terrifyingly beautiful. "Close your eyes," she murmured. I obeyed. A moment later, a stream of perfectly warm water cascaded over my scalp. I let out a soft, involuntary sigh as the heat instantly melted the tension radiating from my neck. Then I felt her hands. Harper pumped a generous amount of rich, incredibly expensive-smelling shampoo into her palms. She didn't wear gloves. Her bare fingers pressed into my scalp, her touch firm, deliberate, and exquisitely soothing. She massaged the soap into my hair, her thumbs tracing the sensitive skin behind my ears and at the base of my skull. It was not a clinical, rushed washing. It was slow, rhythmic, and incredibly intimate. My breath hitched in my throat. The contrast of this woman, who had practically threatened to destroy someone's life just an hour ago, now gently washing my hair with the care of a devoted lover, was entirely intoxicating. "Are you comfortable?" she asked, her voice a low rumble that vibrated over the rushing sound of the water. "Yes," I breathed, my hands gripping the edge of the velvet stool to keep myself anchored. She rinsed the soap away, her fingers combing through the tangled strands with meticulous care. When the water shut off, she wrapped a thick, heated towel around my wet hair, lifting my head gently. I opened my eyes and sat up, turning to face her. Water was dripping down my neck, sliding over my collarbone, disappearing into the edge of my bra. Harper was staring directly at it, her glacial blue eyes suddenly darkening with a profound, heavy intensity that made the air in the bathroom feel suffocatingly thin. She reached out, her thumb brushing away a single drop of water from my collarbone. Contact burned like a branding iron. She didn't pull her hand away. Her thumb slowly dragged upward, tracing the line of my throat until her palm rested against my cheek. I was entirely paralyzed, my heart hammering so loudly I was certain it was echoing off the slate walls. "You are shivering," Harper whispered, her gaze dropping to my lips for a fraction of a second before snapping back up to my eyes. "I'm not cold," I whispered back, completely unable to lie to her. Harper stared at me, the clinical detached surgeon entirely gone, replaced by something hungry, protective, and undeniably possessive. She stood there for a long, agonizing moment, the tension stretching between us until it was ready to snap. Then, very slowly, she stepped back, dropping her hand. "I will leave a clean shirt on the counter," Harper said, her voice slightly strained, the ice returning to her tone as she hastily rebuilt her walls. "Take your time." She turned and practically fled the bathroom, leaving me sitting alone on the velvet stool, clutching the towel to my chest, completely and utterly devastated by the loss of her touch. End of Part 5. Part 6, The Blueprint of a Heart. The heavy frosted glass doors of the master bathroom clicked shut, leaving me entirely alone in the steamy, slate-gray sanctuary. I sat frozen on the velvet stool for what felt like hours, though it could only have been a few minutes. My heart was pounding a frantic, bruised rhythm against my ribs, echoing loudly in the quiet space. I brought my right hand up, my fingertips lightly tracing the path Harper's thumb had taken, from my collarbone up the column of my throat and stopping at the flush of my cheek. My skin was practically vibrating from the phantom weight of her touch. She had retreated so quickly, fleeing the room as if the mere act of touching me without a medical excuse had burned her. Taking a shaky breath, I forced myself to stand. I moved to the expansive vanity, utilizing my one good hand to manage a clumsy sponge bath. I was hyper-aware of the medical wrap Harper had meticulously secured around my fiberglass cast, a physical manifestation of her protective care. Once I felt human again, I slipped into the fresh clothing she had left folded on the marble counter, a pair of incredibly soft dark gray lounge pants and a black long-sleeved Henley shirt with the left sleeve carefully snipped open to accommodate my cast. I towel-dried my hair as best as I could with one hand, letting the damp brown waves fall messily over my shoulders. I took a deep breath, steeling myself, and pushed open the bathroom doors to face the woman who was rapidly unraveling every defense mechanism I possessed. Penthouse was quiet, save for the rhythmic, soothing patter of sleet hitting the massive floor-to-ceiling windows. The Chicago skyline was obscured by a heavy, gray winter storm, making the sleek, minimalist apartment feel strangely like a snow globe suspended high above the chaos of the city. I found Harper in the expansive living area. She was seated on a stark, charcoal gray leather sofa, her long legs crossed elegantly beneath her. A glowing laptop was balanced on her lap, and she was reviewing digital X-rays on a sleek tablet in her hand. But what stopped me dead in my tracks was the fact that she was wearing reading glasses, a pair of sleek, black, wire-rimmed frames that instantly made her look less like a terrifying predatory bird and more like an incredibly stunning, dangerously intelligent scholar. She didn't look up from her screen as I padded barefoot onto the plush rug. Her posture was rigid, her jaw clenched tight. The vulnerable, hungry woman from the bathroom was completely gone, locked away tightly behind a fortress of absolute professionalism. "There is a carafe of water on the kitchen island," Harper stated, her voice clipped and entirely devoid of the warmth that had been there just 20 minutes ago. "I have ordered a late lunch. It should arrive shortly. Have you experienced any throbbing in your fingers?" "No," I replied softly, walking over to the adjacent armchair and carefully sitting down. "Harper, about earlier. Your neurovascular status appears stable, but we must monitor for compartment syndrome," she interrupted swiftly, deliberately speaking over me with a rapid-fire string of medical jargon. She finally looked up, her blue eyes shielded behind the glare of her glasses. "Elevate the arm. Use the decorative pillows. Do not let it hang below your heart." She was rebuilding the wall. She was terrified of what had almost happened, and her default defense mechanism was to hide behind her authority as a physician. I could have backed down. The old Chloe, the one who had spent 3 years shrinking away from Madison's volatile moods, would have apologized, nodded meekly, and remained silent. But Madison was gone, and Harper Vance, despite her icy exterior, was not a bully. She was just guarded. I grabbed a firm, charcoal-colored pillow with my right hand and slid it under my left arm, resting my cast exactly as she commanded. Then I leaned forward, resting my chin on my good hand, and looked directly at her. "I'm not asking about my vascular status, Dr. Vance," I said, my voice steady, though my stomach was doing acrobatics. "I'm asking why you ran away." Harper's fingers froze over the keyboard. For a fraction of a second, the stoic mask slipped, revealing a flash of absolute panic in her glacial eyes. She slowly lowered the tablet, taking off her glasses and placing them on the glass coffee table with a deliberate, sharp click. "I did not run away, Miss Evans," she replied coldly, though the slight tightness in her throat betrayed her. I realized I was crossing a boundary that I strictly maintain. "I am a physician. You are my patient. You are currently in a highly vulnerable state, residing in my home due to extenuating circumstances. My actions in the bathroom were entirely inappropriate, and they will not happen again." Clinical, detached way she summarized the most electric moment of my life felt like a slap in the face. "I see," I murmured, leaning back into the armchair, suddenly feeling very exhausted. "So you brought me to your penthouse, threatened to ruin my ex-girlfriend's life, wrapped my cast in plastic, and washed my hair just to fulfill your Hippocratic oath. Is that right?" Harper's jaw ticked. She stared at me, the silence stretching between us, heavy and suffocating. "I have a duty of care," she finally said, though the words sounded hollow even to her. "You have a savior complex," I countered gently, refusing to let her shut me out. "And you have a very large, very empty apartment that looks like nobody actually lives in it. You like fixing broken things, Harper. But you don't like it when the broken things try to look closely at you." The air in the room grew instantly tense. I had struck a nerve. Harper stood up abruptly, closing her laptop with a sharp snap. "Your lunch has arrived," she announced, completely ignoring my statement. She walked over to the intercom by the front door, pressing the button to allow the concierge to bring the food up the private elevator. We ate in absolute, agonizing silence. Harper had ordered from an incredibly high-end Italian bistro, rich, comforting truffle risotto for me, and a simple Spartan kale salad for herself. We sat at the massive marble kitchen island. I ate awkwardly with one hand, acutely aware of her eyes flickering toward me every time my fork clinked against the porcelain bowl. She was watching me, observing me with that same intense, dissecting gaze, but she refused to speak. By the time the sun began to set, casting the penthouse in deep, moody shadows of gray and blue, the silence had become unbearable. The storm outside had intensified, the sleet turning into a heavy, swirling snowfall that blanketed the city in white. I was sitting on the sofa, mindlessly watching a documentary on the massive flat-screen television, though I couldn't process a single word the narrator was saying. Harper was back at her laptop, working on what appeared to be surgical dictations. "Harper?" I asked softly, breaking the hours-long quiet. She didn't look up, but she paused her typing. "Yes. Why did you become an orthopedic surgeon? Why bones?" Harper let out a quiet sigh, her fingers hovering over the keys. For a moment, I thought she was going to ignore the question and offer another cold deflection. But slowly, she closed the laptop and turned her head to look at me in the dim light. "Because bones are honest," Harper said quietly, her voice losing its sharp edge, settling into a low, melancholic cadence. "When a bone breaks, the damage is visible. It is measurable on an X-ray. The mechanics of fixing it are absolute. You align the pieces, you apply titanium and screws to hold the foundation, and if you do your job perfectly, the body heals itself. It is a puzzle with a definitive structural solution." She looked away, her eyes fixing on the swirling snow outside the window. "Soft tissue is unpredictable," she continued, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "Hearts fail without warning. Brains hemorrhage. Emotions cloud clinical judgment. But bones follow the rules of physics. They bear the weight of the human body, they shatter under appropriate force, and they fuse when properly stabilized. They make sense to me. People do not. The vulnerability in her confession was staggering. She wasn't just talking about surgery, she was talking about her entire worldview. She controlled her environment, she kept her apartment empty and her demeanor freezing because she was terrified of the unpredictable nature of human connection. She liked fixing people, but she didn't know how to let them stay. People are messy, I agreed softly. I carefully shifted on the sofa, sliding a few inches closer to her side of the leather cushions. I spent 3 years trying to follow Madison's rules. I thought if I was just quiet enough, supportive enough, perfect enough, she would love me back in the way I needed. But there was no titanium plate to fix that relationship. It was just broken. Harper finally turned her gaze back to me. The harsh, clinical walls she had built up all afternoon were crumbling, brick by brick, under the weight of the quiet, darkened room. "You did not deserve the treatment you received from her," Harper said, her voice fiercely protective, a sudden warm contrast to her previous clinical detachment. "Your capacity for empathy is a resource, Chloe." She treated it as a commodity to be exploited. "And how do you treat it, Harper?" I asked, my voice barely above a breath. I was pushing my luck, but the invisible magnetic pull between us was too strong to ignore. Harper stared at me. The space between us on the sofa suddenly felt incredibly small, charged with a heavy, dangerous electricity. She looked down at my left arm, resting securely on the charcoal pillow, and then up to my eyes. Slowly, deliberately, she reached across the leather cushions. She didn't touch my face this time. Instead, her long, elegant fingers lightly traced the edge of the fiberglass cast resting against my chest, her knuckles brushing against the soft cotton of my shirt. "I treat it as something fragile," she whispered, her glacial blue eyes darkening in the dim light, locking onto mine with an intensity that made my breath catch in my throat. "Something that requires careful stabilization." Her fingers drifted higher, stopping just below my collarbone. The heat radiating from her skin seeped through the thin fabric of my shirt, sending a wild, reckless thrill straight to my core. She was no longer running away. She was right here, caught in the exact same terrifying gravity that was pulling me under. "Harper," I breathed her name, an involuntary plea escaping my lips. She leaned in, the scent of cedar and winter air enveloping me completely. Her face was mere inches from mine, her gaze dropping to my lips. Tension was agonizing, a perfectly pulled string right on the verge of snapping. "You need to rest, Chloe," Harper murmured, her voice husky, her breath ghosting warmly across my jawline. She didn't pull away. She lingered there, suspended in the unbearable, exquisite space between professionalism and absolute ruin, leaving me desperate, aching, and entirely consumed by the cold surgeon who had accidentally stolen my heart. End of Part 6. Part 7, The Avalanche. For a seemingly endless moment, time in the penthouse entirely stopped. Harper hovered mere inches from my face, her breath ghosting warmly across my jawline, her glacial blue eyes darkened with a heavy, undisguised desire. The space between us crackled with a dangerous, terrifying electricity. I was entirely paralyzed, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, waiting, hoping, desperate for her to close the final fraction of an inch between us. But the ironclad discipline that made Harper Vance a brilliant surgeon ultimately won the battle against her instincts. With a sharp, almost pained intake of breath, she slowly pulled her hand back from my collarbone. She squeezed her eyes shut for a microsecond, her jaw clenching so tightly I could see the muscle feathering beneath her pale skin. When she opened her eyes again, the vulnerable, hungry woman was gone, hastily shoved behind the impenetrable fortress of her professional demeanor. "You need to rest, Chloe," Harper repeated, her voice slightly rougher than usual, the only betraying sign of the internal war she had just fought. She stood up abruptly, putting a safe, clinical distance between us. "The bone requires sleep to begin the preliminary stages of calcification. I will escort you to your room." The sudden loss of her heat left me shivering, despite the warmth of the apartment. I swallowed the lump of disappointment in my throat, nodding silently. I carefully stood up, cradling my heavy fiberglass cast against my chest. She walked me to the guest bedroom in agonizing silence. When we reached the doorway, she didn't step inside. She stood in the hall, her hands clasped tightly behind her back, as if she didn't trust herself to let them hang loosely at her sides. "Good night, Harper," I said softly, leaning my good shoulder against the doorframe, refusing to let her completely rebuild the ice between us. "Thank you for everything today." Harper's gaze flickered to my lips one last time before snapping up to my eyes. "Good night, Miss Evans." She turned and walked down the long, shadowed hallway toward her master suite. I watched her go, my heart aching with a profound, terrifying realization. Madison had broken my spirit over 3 agonizing years. Harper Vance was rewriting my entire soul in less than 48 hours. When I woke up the next morning, the world outside the floor-to-ceiling windows had completely transformed. A massive, blinding white blizzard had swallowed Chicago overnight. The sky was a pale, flat gray, and the snow was falling so thick and fast that I couldn't even see the waters of Lake Michigan. The city, usually a chaotic symphony of sirens and traffic, was entirely muted, wrapped in a heavy, frozen silence. We were completely snowed in. Penthouse felt less like an apartment and more like a space station, hovering above a frozen, inaccessible planet. I navigated my way to the kitchen, moving a little easier today. The deep, hot spike of pain in my wrist had faded into a dull, manageable ache, thanks to the medication and the absolute lack of stress in Harper's home. I expected to find her in her usual immaculate attire, cashmere, tailored trousers, perhaps answering emails with robotic efficiency. Instead, the sight that greeted me in the living area made my breath catch in my throat. Harper was sitting cross-legged on the plush rug in front of the massive, unlit gas fireplace. She was surrounded by scattered medical files and physical X-ray films. But it was her appearance that shocked me. The terrifying Dr. Vance was wearing a pair of faded gray sweatpants and a massive, oversized dark blue hoodie that swallowed her elegant frame. Her dark hair was thrown into a messy, chaotic bun, and she was wearing those wire-rimmed reading glasses again. She didn't look like a surgeon. She looked exhausted, overwhelmed, and incredibly human. I padded quietly across the hardwood floor, stopping at the edge of the rug. She didn't notice me. She was staring intently at a complex X-ray held up to the gray light of the window, her brow furrowed in deep, visible frustration. She let out a heavy, defeated sigh, dropping the film onto the pile and rubbing the heels of her hands against her eyes. "Soft tissue complications?" I guessed softly, breaking the silence. Harper jumped slightly, her hands dropping to her lap. She looked up at me, blinking as if she had forgotten I was even in the apartment. For a second, I saw a flash of embarrassment cross her features. She hated being caught off guard, hated being seen in a state of disarray. "A severe comminuted fracture of the femur," Harper replied, her voice thick with fatigue. She didn't try to get up or put on her usual armor. She just gestured vaguely to the files. "A 22-year-old patient from a multi-vehicle collision earlier this week. I spent 6 hours reconstructing the bone with a titanium rod. But the surrounding muscle tissue was extensively crushed. The blood supply is failing. If I cannot restore the vascular flow by Monday, I will have to amputate." The sheer weight of her words hung heavily in the quiet air. I stared at her, finally understanding the profound, crushing burden she carried beneath her cold exterior. She didn't just fix bones, she held the entire trajectory of people's lives in her hands. "Have you slept at all?" I asked gently, carefully lowering myself onto the edge of the charcoal leather sofa, keeping a respectful distance but ensuring I was entirely focused on her. "Sleep is irrelevant when a puzzle remains unsolved," she muttered, staring blankly at the scattered files. I meticulously aligned the fragments. I followed the biomechanical principles flawlessly. But the tissue is rejecting the trauma. It is refusing to heal. It is entirely outside of my control, and I despise things I cannot control. Her voice cracked on the final word. It was a microscopic fracture in her composure, but to me it sounded like a shattering glass window. I didn't think about the boundaries. I didn't think about the fact that she was my doctor, or that she was wealthy, or that she had literally run away from me the night before. I just saw a woman who was carrying the weight of the world, entirely alone, terrified of failing. I slid off the sofa and sat down on the plush rug directly across from her, crossing my legs awkwardly to accommodate my cast. Harper watched me, her blue eyes wide behind her glasses, tracking my movements with a wariness of a startled animal. "Harper," I said quietly, reaching out with my right hand. I didn't touch her files. I didn't touch her arm. I reached up, my fingers gently grasping the wire frames of her glasses. She froze, entirely rigid, as I carefully slid them off her face and set them on the floor beside us. Without the barrier of the lenses, her eyes were devastatingly beautiful, swimming with an exhaustion she refused to verbalize. "You are not a machine," I told her, my voice steady, grounding her. "You are a brilliant, capable surgeon. But you cannot command a human body to do something it isn't ready to do. You fix the foundation. The rest is up to them. You are allowed to be human. You are allowed to be tired." Harper stared at me. The air between us grew thick, the silence broken only by the muffled sound of the blizzard battering the windows. She looked at my hand, which was now resting in the space between us on the rug, and then up to my face. "I am terrified of being human," she whispered, a confession so raw and honest it made my chest ache. "Because humanity requires vulnerability. It requires caring about outcomes that you cannot guarantee. It requires this." "This?" I echoed, my pulse beginning to race. "You," Harper breathed, the word hanging suspended in the heavy air. Slowly, she moved. She didn't pull away this time. She leaned forward, bridging the small gap between us on the floor. Her hands, usually so cold and clinical, came up to cup my face. Her long fingers slid into my hair, her thumbs resting gently on my cheekbones. Her touch was trembling, a stark contrast to the absolute precision she displayed in the operating room. "You terrify me, Chloe," Harper murmured, her gaze dropping to my lips, the scent of cedar and espresso wrapping around me like a heavy blanket. "I have spent my entire life building a sterile, perfectly controlled environment. And then you walk into my trauma center broken and freezing and you absolutely dismantle me. I cannot control how I feel when I look at you. And I hate it. I hate it." "Then don't control it," I whispered back, leaning my face into the warmth of her palm, entirely surrendering to the pull. "Just let it happen." Harper let out a ragged, desperate breath. And then she kissed me. It wasn't a hesitant, gentle brush of lips. It was a collision. It was years of rigid self-control snapping in a single, devastating instant. Her mouth was hot and demanding, pressing against mine with an intensity that sent a violent shockwave straight down my spine. I gasped into the kiss, my good hand instantly reaching up to fist in the soft fabric of her oversized hoodie, pulling her closer, anchoring myself to her in the center of the storm. Harper groaned softly, a sound that vibrated deep in her chest as she shifted her weight, crowding me backward until my spine met the base of the leather sofa. She followed me down, her body pressing against mine, her hands moving frantically, one tangling deep into my hair, the other carefully, instinctively curving around my waist to avoid putting any pressure on my fractured arm. Kiss deepened, becoming a desperate, hungry exploration. I tasted coffee, mint, and the intoxicating, undeniable flavor of a woman who had finally allowed herself to want something just for herself. I kissed her back with everything I had, pouring 3 years of repressed emotion, gratitude, and fierce, undeniable attraction into the connection. When we finally broke apart, entirely breathless, the silence of the penthouse had completely shifted. It was no longer sterile and cold. It was charged, heavy, and brilliantly alive. Harper rested her forehead against mine, her chest heaving, her eyes squeezed tightly shut as she tried to process the magnitude of what she had just done. Her hands were still securely wrapped around me, holding me as if she was terrified I would disappear into the snowstorm outside. I broke every rule I have ever made for myself, Harper whispered against my lips, her voice ragged. I smiled, my thumb lightly brushing against her jawline. Some things are meant to be broken, Dr. Vance, just so they can heal back stronger. Harper opened her eyes, the glacial ice entirely melted, replaced by a dark, burning devotion that took my breath away. She didn't say another word. She just leaned down and kissed me again. End of Part 7. Part 8, The Thaw. The aftermath of our collision was a profound, echoing silence that felt louder than the blizzard raging outside the penthouse windows. Harper's lips were still a breath away from mine, her chest rising and falling in rapid, uneven intervals. Her long fingers were tangled in my hair, gripping me with a desperate, anchoring strength, as if letting go would send her spiraling off the face of the earth. I kept my good hand fisted in the soft fabric of her oversized blue hoodie, entirely unwilling to break the physical connection that had just altered the trajectory of my entire life. For the first time since I had met the terrifying, brilliant Dr. Vance, she looked entirely undone. The immaculate fortress she had built around her heart was lying in ruins on the plush rug, dismantled by a single reckless kiss. I don't know how to do this, Harper whispered, her voice fractured, lacking all of its usual clinical certainty. She rested her forehead heavily against mine, her eyes tightly closed. I am not equipped for unpredictability. I analyze data. I predict outcomes. I do not blindly jump into the dark. Then don't look at it as jumping into the dark, I murmured, my thumb gently stroking the sharp, elegant line of her jaw. Her skin was burning, radiating a heat that completely betrayed her icy reputation. Look at it as gathering new data. You don't have to have the outcome predicted, Harper. You just have to be here with me right now. Slowly, her glacial blue eyes fluttered open. They were entirely stripped of their protective armor, swimming with a terrifying, beautiful vulnerability. She studied my face, her gaze tracing the curve of my cheek, the line of my nose, and finally, settling on my lips with a hunger that made my pulse instantly spike. Without a word, she shifted her weight. With a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the desperate intensity of our kiss, she carefully gripped my waist and helped me stand up from the floor. She was hyper-aware of my left arm, ensuring the heavy fiberglass cast remained perfectly undisturbed against my chest. She guided me the short distance to the charcoal gray leather sofa, seating me down among the decorative pillows. Then, she reached for a sleek black remote on the glass coffee table and pressed a button. Instantly, the massive modern gas fireplace embedded in the slate wall roared to life, casting a warm, flickering golden-orange glow across the darkened living room. Contrast was striking. Outside, the blizzard was an aggressive, freezing wall of white, burying Chicago beneath inches of snow. Inside, the penthouse had transformed from a sterile, unfeeling museum into a warm, deeply intimate sanctuary. Harper didn't sit in the armchair across from me. Instead, she sat right beside me on the sofa, pulling her legs up underneath her. She hesitated for only a fraction of a second before gently lifting my legs, draping them across her lap. It was an incredibly domestic, grounded gesture that sent a fresh wave of butterflies erupting in my stomach. Madison made me feel like I was taking up too much space, I said softly, the flickering firelight casting dancing shadows across the room. I hadn't planned on speaking about my ex, but the safety of Harper's presence seemed to draw the poison straight out of my chest. Whenever I had a bad day or an opinion or a need, she treated it like an inconvenience. Like I was a flaw in her perfectly curated public image. I spent 3 years shrinking myself down to the size of a supporting character in my own life. Harper's jaw clenched, the muscles feathering beneath her skin. Her hand rested on my knee, her thumb slowly, rhythmically tracing circles into the soft cotton of my sweatpants. It was a soothing, grounding motion that kept me tethered to the present. Madison is a narcissist who lacks the basic psychological capacity for object constancy and empathy, Harper stated flatly, her voice hardening with a fierce, protective edge. She required a mirror, not a partner. You were merely collateral damage in her pursuit of validation. She paused, her eyes reflecting the dancing flames of the fireplace. Her thumb stopped moving on my knee. I was accused of the exact opposite, Harper confessed, her voice dropping to a low, melancholic register. I looked at her, entirely captivated. By who? My last partner. 5 years ago, Harper replied, her gaze fixing on the fire, though she was clearly looking at a memory. She was a pediatric oncologist. Brilliant, empathetic, entirely emotionally available. We were together for 2 years. But the demands of my specialty, the trauma, the hours, the sheer volume of shattered bodies I have to physically reconstruct, began to take a toll. Harper took a slow, deep breath, her fingers tightening slightly against my leg. There was a night when I lost a patient on the table. A complex pelvic fracture that resulted in massive internal hemorrhaging. I tried to clamp the vessels, but the damage was too severe. He bled out in my hands, she recounted, her voice eerily calm, though I could see the ghost of that trauma lingering in the tension of her shoulders. I went home. My partner asked me how my day was. I told her the facts. I relayed the clinical sequence of events that led to the fatality. I washed my hands and I sat down to eat dinner. I watched her, my heart aching as I realized where this was going. She started crying, Harper continued softly. She asked me how I could be so cold, how I could watch a human being die and just state the facts. She called me an unfeeling machine. She said she couldn't share a life with someone who didn't possess a human heart. She packed her things and left that same night. The absolute tragedy of her confession hung heavy in the air. The woman before me wasn't an unfeeling machine. She was a woman who felt so deeply, who carried the weight of life and death so heavily, that she had to compartmentalize her emotions just to survive her profession. Her coldness wasn't a lack of humanity, it was a survival mechanism. It was the armor she wore to prevent the grief from completely crushing her. "You aren't a machine, Harper," I whispered fiercely, reaching over with my good hand to cup her cheek. I forced her to look away from the fire and into my eyes. "You wrap a fractured arm in plastic so your patient can shower. You threaten bullies in hallways to protect someone you barely know. You carry the burden of a 22-year-old's crushed femur on a Saturday morning when you should be resting. You have the biggest heart I have ever encountered. You just guard it fiercely." Harper's breath hitched. She leaned her face into my palm, her eyes fluttering shut. A single, silent tear escaped the corner of her eye, sliding down her cheek to wet my fingertips. It was the most profound, beautiful display of trust one had ever witnessed. "I have spent 5 years convincing myself that I am exactly what she said I was," Harper whispered against my hand. "It was easier to be the icequeen of Chicago Memorial. Ice doesn't bleed, Chloe." "But it melts," I replied softly, my thumb brushing away the tear. "And that's okay." She opened her eyes, a breathtaking, raw devotion shining in the depths of her blue gaze. She leaned in, her lips parting, ready to close the distance between us once again. Suddenly, a harsh, shrill ringing shattered the intimate quiet of the penthouse. Harper flinched, pulling back instantly. The sound wasn't coming from a standard smartphone. It was a piercing, synthetic tone originating from the kitchen island. It was her hospital-issued emergency pager. The spell was broken. The real world, chaotic and demanding, was violently kicking the door down. Harper's entire demeanor shifted in a microscopic fraction of a second. The vulnerable woman on the sofa vanished, replaced instantly by the lead orthopedic surgeon. She stood up, her movements sharp and precise, and practically sprinted to the kitchen counter. I watched her snatch the device, her eyes rapidly scanning the digital readout. Color entirely drained from her face. "Vance!" she barked into the device, hitting a button. I couldn't hear the voice on the other end, but I could hear the frantic, panicked tone buzzing through the small speaker. Harper listened for exactly 5 seconds before cutting them off. "What is his current systolic pressure?" Harper demanded, her voice echoing with absolute authority. She grabbed her tablet with her free hand, frantically pulling up secure medical files. "Listen to me, Eris. The blizzard has shut down all major thoroughfares. The city plows are grounded. I cannot physically get to the trauma center. Another panicked burst of static from the pager. I know his vascular status is failing. Comminuted fragments are likely compressing the femoral artery, Harper snapped, her eyes narrowing as she stared at the glowing tablet screen. If you wait for an emergency transport to fetch me, the tissue will necrotize. You will lose the leg, and if he throws a clot, you will lose the patient. You have to open him up now. I sat frozen on the couch, my heart pounding in my throat. I was watching a life-and-death crisis unfold in real time. Dr. Eris, do not tell me you are only a fourth-year resident, Harper commanded, her voice dropping into a terrifyingly calm, absolute register that left no room for panic. You are a surgeon. Crub in, prep the oar, and set up a secure, high-definition video link to my tablet. You are going to perform a vascular salvage procedure, and I am going to walk you through every single millimeter of the incision. Do you understand me? A brief pause. Then a faint, terrified, "Yes, Dr. Vance." Harper terminated the connection. She stood at the kitchen island, taking one deep, ragged breath, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the marble edge. She turned and looked at me. Tension in the room was suffocating. I expected her to send me away, to tell me to go back to the guest room so she could work in her perfectly controlled, sterile isolation. Instead, she picked up her tablet, walked back to the living room, and sat down on the sofa right beside me. She put her wire-rimmed glasses back on her face. She didn't pull away. She reached out, her fingers wrapping firmly around my right hand, intertwining our fingers and resting our joined hands on her thigh. "Stay with me," Harper whispered, her voice tight with the immense pressure of the impending surgery, yet desperate for the grounding weight of my presence. "Please, Chloe. Just stay right here." "I'm not going anywhere," I promised softly, squeezing her hand with everything I had. Tablet screen chimed, the video link connecting. The sterile, blinding lights of an operating room flooded the screen, illuminating a draped patient and a terrified-looking resident staring into the camera. Harper took a breath, squeezed my hand one last time, and leaned forward into the screen. "All right, Dr. Eris," the cold, brilliant Dr. Vance announced, the ice returning to her voice to command the room. "Scalpel. Let's save this man's life." End of Part 8. Part 9. The Anchor in the Storm. The living room of the penthouse was completely transformed. The serene, quiet intimacy of the fireplace was now competing with the harsh, sterile glow of the tablet screen and the chaotic, muffled sounds of a Level 1 trauma center operating room. I sat frozen on the charcoal leather sofa, my left arm carefully secured in its cast against my chest, while my right hand was entirely engulfed by Harper's. Her grip was startlingly tight, her knuckles pale, anchoring herself to me as she stared down the digital feed. On the screen, Dr. Eris looked like a deer caught in the headlights of an oncoming freight train. He was young, his eyes wide and terrified above his blue surgical mask, surrounded by scrub nurses who were looking at him for direction. He was staring at a mangled, bloodied expanse of a human leg that I quickly had to look away from, my stomach performing a violent flip. But Harper didn't flinch. She leaned forward, the wire-rimmed glasses sliding slightly down the bridge of her nose, her entire being shifting into a state of absolute predatory focus. "Eris, listen to my voice," Harper commanded, her tone slicing through the frantic background noise of the oar like a scalpel. It was the same icy, authoritative voice she had used to dismantle Madison in the hallway, but now it was being used to literally save a life. "Your patient is tachycardic, and the tissue is hypoxic. We do not have time for hesitation. Scalpel. Number 10 blade. You are going to make a longitudinal incision over the medial aspect of the distal thigh. Now." "Dr. Vance, the swelling is massive," Eris stammered, his gloved hands hovering nervously over the patient. "The landmarks are distorted. If I miss the facial plane and nick the superficial femoral artery—" "You will not miss," Harper interrupted, her voice dropping into a register of terrifying calm. "You know the anatomy. I taught you the anatomy." Trust your hands, Eris. Make the incision. I watched in absolute awe as Harper orchestrated the surgery from a leather sofa in the middle of a blizzard. She didn't yell. She didn't panic. She used her cold, unyielding demeanor as a shield, not just for herself, but to protect the young resident on the screen from his own terror. She projected absolute certainty so that he could borrow it. For the next 2 hours, the penthouse was filled with the tense, staccato rhythm of surgical commands. Retract the sartorius muscle. Ligate those smaller branches. Give me a wider view of the distal fragment. Every time Eris encountered a complication, every time the monitors in the background beeped with a frantic, warning rhythm, Harper's hand would squeeze mine with bone-crushing force. She was absorbing the shock of the crisis, holding it inside her body so she could project only calm instruction through the screen. And I, in turn, stroked my thumb rhythmically over her knuckles, silently pouring every ounce of strength and grounding energy I had back into her. I realized then, with a profound, aching clarity, exactly how wrong her ex-partner had been. Harper wasn't a machine devoid of feeling. She felt everything. The burden of this man's life was resting entirely on her shoulders, miles away, and the weight of it was so heavy it was physically vibrating through her hand. She cared so deeply, so fiercely, that it was a miracle it hadn't destroyed her. "I have the arterial compression located, Dr. Vance," Eris announced, his voice tight but significantly steadier than it had been an hour ago. "The bone fragment is completely pinching the vessel. I'm preparing to shift it." "Carefully, Eris," Harper breathed, her entire body rigid beside me. She leaned so close to the tablet her nose almost brushed the screen. "If the artery is compromised, you will have a massive hemorrhage the second you relieve the pressure. Have your vascular clamps ready. Do not blink." The tension in the room spiked to an unbearable, suffocating level. I stopped breathing, my eyes fixed on Harper's sharp profile, illuminated by the flickering firelight and the harsh blue glow of the tablet. "Shifting the fragment now," Eris said. A collective gasp echoed through the tablet's speaker. "Pulse!" a nurse called out from the background, her voice laced with sudden, ecstatic relief. "Blood pressure is stabilizing. We have distal pulse in the foot, Dr. Vance. Flow is restored." Harper let out a long, ragged exhale, her shoulders dropping a full 2 inches as the immense tension instantly drained out of her frame. She closed her eyes behind her glasses, a look of profound, exhausted relief washing over her beautiful features. "Excellent work, Dr. Eris," Harper said, her voice finally losing its icy edge, sounding incredibly human and incredibly tired. "Secure the fragment with a temporary external fixator until I can physically get into the OR on Monday to finish the internal reconstruction. Close the fascia loosely to prevent compartment syndrome. You saved his leg today." "I thank you, Dr. Vance." "Thank you," Eris stammered, the awe and gratitude in his voice unmistakable. "I will be monitoring the chart remotely," Harper said. "Vance out." She hit the button to terminate the connection. Tablet screen went black. The silence that rushed back into the penthouse was deafening. The blizzard continued to howl against the floor-to-ceiling windows, but inside, the crisis had passed. Harper didn't move. She sat staring at the black screen of the tablet on the coffee table, her chest rising and falling in shallow, exhausted breaths. Slowly, her grip on my hand loosened, her fingers uncurling, but she didn't pull away. I waited a moment, letting the adrenaline fully drain from the room. Then I carefully shifted my weight, turning on the sofa to fully face her. With my good hand, I reached out and gently removed the wire-rimmed glasses from her face, setting them on the cushion beside us. "You did it," I whispered into the quiet room. "You saved him." Harper slowly turned her head to look at me. Her glacial blue eyes were heavy, swimming with an exhaustion so profound it looked almost painful. She looked down at our hands, still resting together on her thigh. "I have never let anyone stay," Harper confessed, her voice barely more than a ragged rasp. "When the pager goes off, when I have to guide a trauma or review a critical file from home, I lock the door to my office. I shut everyone out. My ex used to complain that I turned into a ghost when the hospital called. I didn't want anyone to see how much it costs me. I didn't want them to see the panic. I didn't see panic, Harper, I said fiercely, my thumb tracing the delicate bones of her wrist, feeling the frantic, racing pulse beneath her skin. I saw brilliance. I saw a woman who cares so much about a stranger's life that she was willing to shoulder the entire burden of saving it from miles away. You were incredible. Harper swallowed hard, her eyes searching mine for any trace of the judgment or disgust she had been conditioned to expect. She found none. She found only absolute awe and a terrifyingly deep affection. Without a word of warning, Harper's remaining walls entirely collapsed. She let out a broken, exhausted sound, leaning forward and burying her face in the crook of my neck. I gasped softly at the sudden contact, my heart doing a wild, erratic flip. My right arm immediately came up to wrap around her back, pulling her tightly against me. She practically melted into my embrace, the terrifying, formidable Dr. Vance entirely surrendering to the exhaustion. She wrapped her arms around my waist, being incredibly careful of my cast, and buried her face against my collarbone, breathing in the scent of my skin like it was oxygen. "You didn't run," she whispered against my neck, her breath sending wild shivers cascading down my spine. "You stayed. You held my hand." "I told you I wasn't going anywhere," I murmured, resting my chin on the top of her head. Her dark hair was soft, smelling of that intoxicating cedar shampoo. I stroked her back, feeling the tension slowly, finally leaving her muscles. We sat like that for a long time on the charcoal sofa, bathed in the warm, golden light of the fireplace while the snowstorm raged outside. It was a stark, beautiful contrast to my past. When Madison was stressed, she made herself huge and made me tiny. She pushed me away, blamed me, and abandoned me. Harper, despite her icy reputation and her terrifying intellect, pulled me close. She let me be her anchor in the middle of a storm. Eventually, the adrenaline crash fully hit her. Harper's breathing deepened, evening out into the steady rhythm of sleep. She had essentially passed out in my arms, exhausted from a 14-hour shift followed by the emotional toll of a remote surgery. I didn't try to move her. I carefully adjusted my position, leaning back against the armrest of the sofa and pulling a cashmere throw blanket from the back of the couch, draping it over both of us. Harper shifted slightly in her sleep, burying her face deeper into my chest, her hand clutching the fabric of my shirt. As I sat there, listening to the soft crackle of the fire and the steady, reassuring sound of Harper's breathing, I looked out the window. The snow was beginning to slow down. The thick, white wall of the blizzard was breaking apart, revealing the dark, icy waters of Lake Michigan in the distance. The storm was passing. A sudden, sharp pang of anxiety pierced through my chest, entirely disrupting the peaceful bubble we had created. The blizzard was the only reason I was still here. It was the excuse we had both used to ignore the reality of our situations. But by tomorrow, the city plows would clear the streets. The hospital would demand its lead surgeon back. My reality, my drafty apartment, my empty bank account, my shattered wrist would be waiting for me. We had built something incredible in the isolation of this penthouse, but I had absolutely no idea if this fragile, beautiful connection could survive the harsh, blinding light of the real world. I pressed a soft, lingering kiss to the top of Harper's head, holding her a little tighter as the fire began to die down. "Please don't let me go when the snow melts," I prayed silently into the quiet room. End of Part 9. Part 10, The Anchor and the Ice. The harsh, blinding glare of the morning sun reflecting off the pristine, snow-covered city is what finally pulled me from the deepest sleep of my life. I blinked my eyes open, disoriented for a fraction of a second. I was still on the massive charcoal leather sofa in the penthouse living room, completely cocooned in the soft cashmere throw blanket. But the warm, heavy weight of Dr. Harper Vance against my chest was gone. The space beside me was empty, the leather cool to the touch. My heart executed a slow, dreadful plummet into my stomach. I sat up, cradling my heavy fiberglass cast against my ribs. The world outside the floor-to-ceiling windows had completely transformed once again. The blizzard had passed, leaving behind a breathtaking, glittering expanse of white. But more importantly, the muted silence of the storm had been replaced by the faint, rhythmic scraping of city plows and the distant wail of a siren. The roads were clear. The city was awake. The magic of our isolated, frozen sanctuary was officially over. I swung my legs off the couch, my bare feet hitting the plush rug. Panic, sharp and familiar, began to claw at my throat. Had Harper woken up regretting everything? Had the intimacy, the desperate kiss, the fact that she had fallen asleep in my arms terrified her so much that she had entirely retreated behind her walls of ice? The plows cleared Lakeshore Drive at 5 a.m. I jumped, spinning around. Harper was standing at the edge of the open-concept kitchen, leaning against the marble island. She wasn't wearing the oversized blue hoodie from the night before, which felt like a physical blow to my chest. She was dressed in her formidable armor, a crisp, tailored navy blue blouse tucked into sleek black trousers. Her dark hair was pulled back into its severe, immaculate bun, and the wire-rimmed reading glasses were nowhere to be seen. She held a steaming mug of black coffee, her glacial blue eyes unreadable and entirely focused on me. She looked exactly like the terrifying orthopedic surgeon who had walked into my emergency room curtain 3 days ago. "Oh," I breathed, my voice sounding incredibly small in the massive, sunlit room. I swallowed hard, trying to maintain whatever shred of dignity I had left. "Right. So the city is open again." "Yes," Harper stated, her voice smooth, calm, and completely devoid of the raw vulnerability that had laced her words the night before. "The hospital is fully operational. Dr. Eris successfully stabilized the patient. The crisis has concluded. Crisis has concluded." The words felt like a scalpel slicing directly into my chest. She wasn't just talking about the surgery. She was talking about us. She was politely, clinically informing me that my time in her perfectly controlled world had come to an end. I looked down at the floor, fighting the sudden burning sting of tears in my eyes. I refused to cry in front of her. Madison had taken 3 years of my tears. Harper Vance was not going to get them too, even if she was breaking my heart with far more surgical precision. "I understand," I said, forcing my voice to remain steady. I walked over to the glass coffee table, picking up my small black clutch with my right hand. I should order a car. I need to get back to Logan Square. My roommate is probably wondering if I'm dead, and I need to figure out how to navigate my classroom with one hand by Monday. Harper didn't move. She took a slow sip of her coffee, her eyes tracking my movements like a hawk. "A rideshare will be incredibly expensive due to the surge pricing from the snow." "It's fine," I lied, knowing my bank account was currently weeping. I pulled my phone out of my clutch, tapping the screen to wake it up. "I'll manage. Thank you, Dr. Vance, for the medical care and for letting me weather the storm here. I know I was an enormous inconvenience." I opened the app, my thumb hovering over the request ride button, my vision blurring just enough to make the screen fuzzy. Suddenly, a shadow fell over my phone. Before my thumb could make contact with the glass, a long, elegant hand shot out, wrapping firmly around my wrist, my good wrist. Touch was electric, sending a violent shockwave straight up my arm. I gasped, looking up. Harper had crossed the room with terrifying, silent speed. She was standing mere inches from me, the scent of cedar and espresso wrapping around me instantly. She didn't let go of my wrist. Instead, she reached out with her other hand and smoothly plucked the phone directly out of my grasp. "Hey," I started in protest, bewildered. Harper tossed the phone onto the plush sofa behind me. She didn't step back. She stepped closer, invading my space, crowding me until the backs of my knees bumped against the edge of the coffee table. "I did not say you could leave, Chloe," Harper said, her voice dropping into that low, dangerous, possessive register that made my entire body flush with heat. "You?" I stammered, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. "You put your armor back on. You put your hair up. You called me an inconvenience. You called yourself an inconvenience, Harper corrected swiftly, her glacial blue eyes darkening with an intense, burning fire that entirely melted her icy facade. I simply stated that the roads were clear. And I put my hair up because I have spent the last 3 hours on the phone with the chief of surgery, rearranging my schedule so I do not have to step foot inside that hospital for the next 4 days. I stared at her, my mouth slightly open, entirely failing to comprehend the data she was presenting to me. 4 days? But you live at that hospital. I used to, Harper murmured. She finally let go of my right wrist, only to bring both of her hands up to cup my face. Her palms were warm, her long fingers sliding gently into the tangled mess of my brown hair. Clinical detached surgeon was completely gone. The woman holding me was fiercely determined, terrified, and entirely devoted. I told you last night that I analyze data and predict outcomes, Harper whispered, her thumbs brushing rhythmically across my cheekbones, her gaze locked onto mine with an intensity that took my breath away. I spent the entire morning analyzing the data of the past 3 days. I analyzed the fact that you stood up to a woman who emotionally terrorized you simply because I asked you to. I analyzed the fact that you held my hand while I held a man's life in mine, and you didn't flinch. You didn't call me a machine. You anchored me. My breath hitched. I leaned into her touch, entirely captivated by the desperate, beautiful logic of her confession. And what was your conclusion, Dr. Vance? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. My conclusion, Harper said, her voice trembling slightly, the final wall of her fortress crumbling into dust, is that sending you back to a drafty apartment in Logan Square would be the most catastrophic, illogical mistake of my entire life. My conclusion is that this penthouse has been empty for 5 years, and the thought of you walking out that door makes me feel like I am suffocating. Tears, warm and undeniable, finally spilled over my eyelashes. Harper immediately brushed them away with her thumbs, her expression twisting with a fierce, protective ache. Harper, I breathed, overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of what she was saying. We just met. Time is a relative construct, Harper countered smoothly, though a tiny, breathless smile tugged at the corner of her lips. I am a surgeon, Chloe. When I see a fracture, I do not wait weeks to decide if it needs to be set. I take immediate, decisive action. I know exactly what I am looking at. She leaned in, her forehead resting gently against mine, our breaths mingling in the quiet, sunlit room. Do not order a car, Harper pleaded, the absolute command in her voice entirely replaced by a raw, desperate vulnerability. Stay here. Let me take care of you. Let me cook for you. Let me prove to you that you are not an inconvenience, but the absolute center of my gravity. Move your things in. Break all of my rules, Chloe. Please. It was the most terrifying, reckless, and beautiful proposition I had ever received. 3 days ago, I had been crying in a freezing emergency room, entirely broken and alone. Now, the most brilliant, formidable woman in Chicago was holding my face like I was the most precious thing she had ever encountered, begging me to stay. I didn't need to analyze the data. I already knew my answer. Okay, I whispered, a tearful, radiant smile breaking across my face. I brought my right hand up, my fingers tangling in the collar of her crisp navy blouse, pulling her just a fraction closer. Okay, Harper. I'll stay. Harper let out a ragged, shuddering breath of absolute relief. And then she kissed me. It wasn't like the frantic, desperate collision from the night before, born out of exhaustion and fear. This kiss was intentional. It was deep, confident, and overwhelmingly romantic. Her mouth moved against mine with a slow, savoring heat, claiming me with an absolute certainty that sent a wild, intoxicating thrill straight down my spine. I kissed her back with everything I had, pouring all of my joy, my gratitude, and my fiercely blooming love into the space between us. When she finally pulled back, we were both breathless. The severe, immaculate bun at the nape of her neck was slightly ruined, strands of dark hair falling beautifully across her forehead. She looked completely undone and absolutely glowing. "Come on," Harper murmured, her voice husky, her blue eyes shining with a rare, genuine light. She took my right hand, intertwining her long fingers with mine. "I made breakfast. And then we are going to look at your calendar and determine the most efficient way to pack up your apartment." I laughed, the sound echoing brightly off the slate and marble walls of the penthouse. As she led me toward the kitchen island, the morning sun bathing us in a warm, golden glow, I looked down at my heavy fiberglass cast. The dull ache in my wrist was still there, a physical reminder of the night my life had fallen apart. But as Harper squeezed my hand, pulling out a leather barstool for me with a gentle, protective smile, I realized something profound. Madison had broken my bone, but Dr. Harper Vance had completely healed my heart. End of story. Wow, what an incredible journey that was. From being abandoned in a freezing emergency room by a toxic ex, to finding absolute love, protection, and healing with the seemingly cold but fiercely devoted Dr. Harper Vance. Chloe's story is the perfect reminder that sometimes the things that break us lead us exactly to where we are meant to be. The tension, the emotional walls coming down, and that undeniable chemistry. I am completely obsessed with these two. If this story made your heart race as much as it did mine, please don't forget to leave a huge thumbs up on this video. I want to hear from you, so drop a comment down below and let me know, what was your absolute favorite moment? Were you Team Harper from the very beginning? Let's talk about it in the comments. And if you want to hear more passionate, romantic, and thrilling stories just like this one, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new upload from your GL girlfriend. Thank you all so much for watching, for your amazing support, and for being the best community ever. I'll see you in the next story. Bye.